All right. My name is Amber Ritchie. I'm a librarian at VPL's Programming and Learning Department. And I'd like to begin this morning by acknowledging that my home and the VPL's locations are all on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. If you're joining us from outside Vancouver and you'd like to know the history of the land that you're on, check out this amazing resource of www.whosland.ca and you can find out the history of what you're on. And now I'm delighted to turn this over to the lovely Cheryl McKay from CBC's North by Northwest, who will be in conversation with Jennifer. Thank you and welcome, Cheryl.
Thank you, Amber. Thanks. Well, this is exciting. Glad to be back in Booked at VPL again, and so delighted to be having an opportunity to talk with Jennifer Robson. Jennifer's latest book, as Amber was mentioning, Our Darkest Night, is a wonderful read. You'll laugh, you'll cry, and it's just the latest in her terrific exploration of the Second World War, really, from all kinds of different angles. And as I mentioned on the radio this morning when I was talking about this, Jennifer is an expert. Besides being an expert at writing fiction, she's an expert at researching as well, because she has a doctorate, a PhD in history from Oxford University. And I am delighted to welcome Jennifer to the VPL Book Club today. Jennifer, it's so great to see you.
Hello, it's wonderful to see you, Cheryl, because the last time we talked, of course, we don't get to see each other
No.
typically when it's via the airwaves, as it were. So, and I'm particularly admiring your spectacles.
I needed some color for spring.
A little boost of spring color, yeah.
Yes. And welcome to everybody who's here. It's been terrific to see all the names and places popping up.
Yeah.
And I know that Jennifer, you've got friends here and friends in Ontario.
I do. Yeah. Well, because my Robson, I mean, it might make it seem like my family goes way back in Vancouver, but my parents are both from Vancouver. Were born. My dad is from West Point Grey, and my mom grew up at West Van. So they went to Lord Byng and West Van High, respectively, and then both were at UBC. And I think three of my four grandparents came from England. Two from England, one from Scotland. My grandma would not be happy if I accused her of being English, but all settled in Vancouver. But there's no connection with the Robsons of Robsonstrasse. We were much more humble than that in our background.
You could claim it, I guess, claim that connection.
Exactly, yeah. But the one thing I love is that when I talk to anyone from Vancouver, they spell my name right. They don't put an IN in the middle or anything, and they know how to pronounce it. I find a lot of the time when I'm talking to people from the States, they want to say Robeson. Yeah, maybe like Paul Robeson. Yeah. So no, I'm definitely plain old Robson. Yeah.
Jennifer, this book is amazing. Our Darkest Night. Yeah, it kept me up, I have to tell you.
Yeah, it was a labor of love. It really was. I dedicated it to my husband, but it was written really. I mean, it came out of a place of wanting to know more about his family history, because it's the family history of my children as well. And
please, tell that story about how the comment or the thought that started this whole thing, a question from
one straight question. And I mean, I think this happens with a lot of book ideas where you're as a writer, you're ambling along and you really have no idea that an idea is going to fall out of the sky like an anvil and hit you. And in my case, I was working on a completely different book, which actually was, I think, destined to be terrible. And I wasn't in love with the idea. It just wasn't really setting me on fire. And I think the idea for a book has to set you on fire. Otherwise, how will you continue through with the research, the writing, and talking about it for a few years? And so I was grappling with, I don't know what I'm going to do, and thinking, I think I may have to call my editor and tell her I'm in trouble, which is the last thing you ever want to do as a writer. And my son came to me. He was in grade 9 at the time. and they were studying the Second World War. And he had been talking about the Holocaust with one of his friends at school. And he remembered having heard stories about his great grandfather having helped to save Jewish people during the war. And he wanted to know if it was true. And the thing is, I couldn't tell him definitively if it was true. And so I didn't need much encouragement to set aside my work in progress and just turn to this, as much because my son asked this, but also selfishly I thought, oh, well, now I have something more important to do than work on this terrible book that's not turning into anything. The thing is, after about day one of digging in, I knew that there was something there that absolutely superseded anything else I was working on in terms of the potential for a story. And so the background is that my husband's grandparents, his maternal grandparents, during the war, they lived in a little town. In fact, most of the family still lives there, called San Zenone delle Ezzelini, which is about 70 kilometers to the north west of Venice, and it's in the foothills of the mountains right near Monte Grappa, which is the site of historic battles in both the First and Second World Wars. And it's kind of one of those places that tends to just geographically get hammered during major conflicts, because it's really that it's right on the route that anybody invading from the north would take to pour into Italy. And we had discovered in 2016, just in a casual conversation with my husband's Zia Maria, his Aunt Maria, that her father, starting in about 1943, had been asked by their local priest to take in Italian Jews, for the most part, who were in danger of being arrested and deported. And at the time, they weren't sure deported where. We now know, of course, that the deportation was to Birkenau, and that almost every Italian Jew who was deported was murdered there. But nonetheless, even not knowing that, they knew the situation was dire. And so Claudio's grandparents, it's our belief that they did take in at least 3 separate families over the next, say, 2.5 years, and had them living in the upstairs of their very tiny, very modest little house that was already crammed with relatives. They were not wealthy people; they were barely scraping by. The first, we accepted this. We were, first of all, just practically fell off our chairs. We'd never heard anything about this from my husband's late parents. And I think now the reason is that it was just along with general reticence in talking about the war. If I'd ever asked his mother straight up, oh, by the way, Ma, did your father shelter Jews during the war? First of all, she would have been surprised, but I think she would have answered me truthfully. She would have said, well, yes. But it just never came up. It's one of these things, and I think a lot of us have these regrets where we discover after someone has passed away all these incredible things about them, and we
there's
just never
nobody
had.
left to answer. Yeah.
Yeah, and that certainly happened with my own grandmother, who was. There may be a few people listening who knew Nikki Moyer, but she was just an incredible woman who worked as a journalist during the war, and I knew that, and yet did I talk about it with her? I didn't. So to return back to the family story, I had these bit nuggets of knowledge that I had then myself not actually done anything about digging into. Life had got in the way. I'd always intended to, but I just never got around to it. And so I started digging. I kind of put on my historian's hat, and almost right away realized that there really was something to the stories, that they weren't just family anecdotes. And I should add, I never ever thought that anyone in the family would lie about it, but stories can get exaggerated over the decades. Something that can begin as someone they knew turned into someone who was a cousin, who turns into a family member, and nobody's lied deliberately. It's like that old game of telephone that you play as kids. Yeah. And but as soon as I started looking well, the first place I thought to look, the absolute first place was Yad Vashem, which is the organization based in Israel that researches acts of altruism by Gentiles in regards to helping Jews during the war, and they have an incredible database that is very, very thorough. And I thought if somehow there's proof, it's probably going to be there. And there is proof, not specific to my husband's family, but to just the larger community effort in Sansanone. And so the priest in Sansanone, who Father Odostoko, who is the priest at this what looks almost like a basilica. It's so enormous, but it was just the parish church. It just happened to be a very grand one. And that right now, when we return to Italy, hopefully one day soon, we can look out the window at my husband's aunt's house, and there it is. The bells wake us in the morning. So he was parish priest there, and a humble man, had no ties to the church or anyone of influence, but he took it upon himself to do what he felt was right. And what he felt was right was to save initially, or to help to save initially, Jews in the neighborhood, and then farther afield as word spread that he was a man you could go to who would help. And so he helped by hiding Jewish refugees among his parishioners. And so Yad Vashem concluded that he had saved at a minimum at least 50 people. They felt that it was in fact much more, but the investigation happened in 2010. So there's a limit to what they could prove at that distance of time. Several people from Sansanone were also recognized as having helped. But the researchers concluded that probably everyone in Sansanone, to one degree or another, was involved. They had been, and it's not that anyone felt compelled to, but they acted by example. So their priest, this very, very good and decent man, was telling them that this was the right thing to do. And so they helped. And so he and some of the parishioners in Sansanone were named righteous among the nations on December 1st, 2010. And that is about as far as I was able to go in terms of, although I kept digging for months and months and months and talked to the relatives. And in terms of getting what a researcher, a historian would think of as evidence that was absolutely conclusive, I was never able to find it. Practically speaking, it's not as if anyone was going to write down what they were doing.
No.
No. And then provide evidence for the Nazis to track you away. I mean, so it always was going to be word of mouth. But also, my husband's grandparents had died many years ago. His grandfather died in 1980, and his grandmother about a decade earlier than that. And so there was nobody left really to testify except people who had been little children during the war. And it's those people whose testimony I've had to rely on. And so it's imperfect. But all of that is to say that, yes, we discovered this incredible family story and the connections, which are amazing. But I realized right away that wasn't actually the point. Proving that we have, that my children have this connection to this moment of heroism would have been wonderful, but it's actually not the point. The point, I realized, was that in this very humble little farming town, really more of a village than, it's grown a bit since then, but it's still a very small place, that people helped, that people acted for the good of others, and for the most part for the good of strangers
at great personal risk.
Right? At great personal risk. And so that was what I thought, that's what I found I continue to find most inspiring. Well, actually not most inspiring. What inspires me the most are the people who were in danger, who had to leave everything behind, who had been born Italians for the most part, who grew up as Italians, being told that they were Italian, being part of Italian society. And then with the stroke of a pen in 1938, were disenfranchised of almost everything in terms of just their public uh, role in society. So they were no longer able to go to school, to hold property, to work in professions. Just the list of anti-Semitic uh, kind of limitations were just it was actually more thoroughgoing than what was in force in Germany at the same time. And then from then on to the Nadir, which is 1943, the beginning of the Nazi occupation and the roundups of Jews. And all I could think of was, what must it have been like to be someone who, suddenly you've lost everything. All you have left is your life. If you're lucky, maybe your beloved family members are with you, but you might well be on your own. And then what happens? What do you do? Where can you possibly go? And that's where the idea for this story came. It
And
is to
the idea for Nina too, your main character.
yeah. And so Nina was kind of an almost organic creation. The more I learned about the story, the more the figure of this woman, was kind of nebulous at first, but then, took shape. And to the point where even before I had her name, I could see her face. I could hear her voice. I had a sense of her character, and of what strength it would have taken for her to continue on, shorn of everything that kind of grounded her in the world, that every attachment she had, and how did she find the strength to continue on? And that's what I wanted to explore with this story.
Jennifer, you were talking about the research that you did on this, and the research I know that you do for all the books. And when we talked before, we talked a little bit about the fact that you studied history in great depth, did a PhD in history at Oxford. Was it your intention at one point to be an academic, to be a researcher, or was novel writing always in the picture?
I went to Oxford with the idea that I would end up teaching history, just like my dad, who's not so long ago retired from the University of Victoria, and before that he taught at Trent University in Ontario for many years. And his interest was always, as much as he has still, a thoroughgoing knowledge of the military history of the two world wars. His focus has always been the people who are caught up in these wars, both the soldiers and, or say, the combatants and the civilians. And that has always been my interest too. And I thought I'd teach the history from a conventional point of view. But teaching positions are really thin on the ground. They have been for a number of years. And I just wasn't, when I finished in 1997, I wasn't able to get a teaching position. And I moved sideways into journalism and editing. And then it was just when I was at home with my children, when they were very little, and that would be, coming up 15 years ago, that it just, I think there had always been a little spark of something in me that wanted to write fiction as opposed to, say, a narrative nonfiction. And I'd never been quite brave enough to explore it. I was always so nervous that, well, I wouldn't be any good at it. I knew I could write nonfiction, but I just wasn't sure about that. And so I just very quietly started writing this book, which turned into my first book, Somewhere in France, about, I just was interested in writing a story set in the Great War from the point of view of a woman. And it took shape very slowly, very imperfectly. The only person I told was my sister. I didn't even tell my husband, funnily enough. I just really, I just needed one person to bounce it off, and Kate was a good person to kind of bounce my ideas off. And it took me about, say, 2.5, 3 years to write that book. And by the end of it, I still wasn't sure if I knew what I was doing. And I will freely admit, I mean, unlike many, writers, I have no training in creative writing. I don't have an MFA. I've never attended any, one of the programs we we hear of, attached to the universities. I learn with every book. I know, my books are not perfect, far from, and I'm teaching myself as I go with the help of my editors. But it was something that once I pulled off kind of writing one book, and then the second one was a little bit easier, and the third one was a little bit easier in terms of figuring out what to do. I realized that that was how I wanted to teach. Insofar, I mean, and that actually sounds really pompous, but I feel as if there are any lessons that I can impart about the wars that kind of that shaped the last century and how they affected the people who lived through them. I think I feel as if in some ways I can do it most effectively through fiction. Um, and it's a blast, right? I mean, I get all the fun of teaching without any departmental meetings, any of the any marking, right? The marking is actually my stuff that's getting marked. It's my editor does the marking, and I do a lot of self-editing as I go because I worked as an editor for so many years. I'm a bit obsessive about that, but it's fun, right? And all I love researching, so that's great. And then the kind of the lecturing, I guess it's really moments like this where I get to start. Yeah, I wouldn't. I hope it's not yammering on, but the sense of being able to discuss something that I feel really passionately about, because I just feel that the stories of people who lived through those times, who endured so much, they're stories that they mattered then and they matter now, and I just want to share as many of them as I can.
With that in mind, Jennifer, I just see a note here. Amber, I just wonder if you could read this note from a listener, a viewer. I guess we're viewers, aren't we, with
Yeah.
Zoom? The one
Sure.
about family members there, Amber. That sounds
Yeah.
intriguing.
So I'm not sure of the name because it's a username here, but they wrote in the chat, my grandfather's family was from Cavasso del Tomba, very
Yeah.
near to your husband's family and Montegrappa.
Yeah.
We now wonder from your wonderful story if others in our family assisted in resistance during the war. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. The thing is, it's worth doing a little digging if you can, and it's hard. I mean, it's been 75 years at a minimum. It's hard to find those answers, but that part of Italy was an absolute just a hotbed of resistance, not just in terms of people like Father Stocco, who helped to hide refugee Jews, but also in terms of the partisans, and it kind of it drove the occupying Nazis nuts, to be honest, in terms of how many people were working very hard to get in their way. Insofar as in my husband's family, the farm was raided a few times by Nazis over the course of the war, and that would be when they had people hiding there, and just my heart starts to pound when I think about it. And I've seen the farmhouse where they're living, and I've been shown the window through which people had to climb out the window and hide on the stable roof and kind of flatten themselves against the roof. And then inside, a wardrobe was pulled in front of the window so that if anyone stormed through the house, they wouldn't notice necessarily that there was a window behind it. But really, what I realize now is most likely it wasn't necessarily that the people who were looking, it would probably have been the local fascists with maybe just a token German officer. They weren't necessarily looking for refugee Jews, although it would have been terrible if they had found them. They were more likely looking for partisans, who they were quite happy to. I mean, if you're lucky, you'd get hauled off to prison. If you weren't, they would just haul you outside and shoot you in the courtyard. But it was just this focus of attention by the invaders. And it was just a perilous place to be. And I should add also too, they were being bombed, every few nights. It was, there are very few happy memories that my husband's older relatives have of that time. And I wove, a lot of their reminiscences into the book to again offer some perspective of what it was like to be an ordinary person living through those times.
Jennifer, as I'm sitting here looking at you, and I'm looking at the books
Yeah,
over your shoulder, right? People always have to look at each other's bookshelves.
Yeah.
And I don't want to miss the opportunity today too to talk about the gown, because I was thinking it was so poignant today that here we are on the day of Prince Philip's funeral.
Yeah.
And the book about the wedding dress that was
created
for the then Princess Elizabeth.
I admit to having got up very, very early and to watch, and not quite as early as friends in Vancouver, of course. And I found it intensely moving. My heart stopped a little at the sight of the Queen sitting by herself. And it just did what it underlined to me again was the passing of this greatest generation. He was a young man during the war. He comported himself with extreme valor. And he died as a very elderly man. And that just again underscores how few people are left with whom we can directly share memories of the war. And I just, and also too with COVID, I mean, there are a lot of people, elderly people who have been struck down by COVID who ought to have had, at least a number of years ahead of them. And that is, again, intensely upsetting. I don't know any better way to describe it. But it does, just thinking of the life that Prince Philip had, the historian in me is always fascinated by these moments. And to think here's a man, who not only served with valor during the Second World War and was at the side of the woman who's been monarch for longer than anyone else in history. But his great aunt was the Tsarina of Russia, who was murdered in 1917. I mean, this man is almost like a Zelig figure in terms of his attachment to, or his presence at these key moments of the 20th century. He was present at the Japanese surrender in 1945. As a naval officer, and to have we think of the Queen as a central figure in the 20th century, which she indeed was, but Philip in some way had a reach that's even broader, and all of that was brought home to me this morning, and to have him present on, I'll just move over, so there he is at the corner of the book cover. He doesn't play a role in the book, and the princess herself is very peripheral to the proceedings, and that I really did want to focus on the lives of ordinary people in the post-war period. But there's part of me now that thinks, if I had taken the route of including the royals, how would I have worked that? And would it have been through the perspective of the princess, or what about this penniless prince that had become her fiance? I think a lot of writers do that. We have moments we think, oh, if I'd taken this decision earlier on and gone down a different route, what would the book have been like? I'm happy with it as it is. And I think of it, they may not be on the page in the book, but they're present nonetheless. And there is a description of him, one of my characters is present for the wedding ceremony and just sees the kind of the very handsome young man with
Yeah.
the bright blonde hair, which, photographs, I will say photographs do not capture as well as they could just how breathtakingly handsome he was. Once you've seen a color photograph of him when he was in his 20s, you realize exactly why he caught her eye. I mean, it actually is quite romantic, I will say.
I love
So.
the fact too that he kept her laughing all these years.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one thing that I find interesting, and I'm glad that we've seen, is that he was a far from perfect person, and I think he probably would have been the first to admit it. But he was also a far more complex person than I think the caricature of him, which typically was what was served up for public consumption, would show, and that intellectually he had depths that I will admit had not suspected. I think he would make. I just had never suspected him to have been so deeply interested in theology, in music, in all sorts of things, and that he was quite a fine writer too, which I think is an accolade that he might actually. I mean, he didn't love being praised, but he might have been okay with that.
You might accept that.
He might have accepted that. Yeah.
Jennifer, what was the beginning point for the gown, for that story of the women working away behind the
Yeah.
scenes, like you say, on the wedding dress for Princess Elizabeth?
So the question started because my previous book, which is called Good Night from London, it takes place really beginning in 1940 and it ends on VE Day in 1945. And I just had an urge, not necessarily to continue the story of my characters, as much as I love picking up characters here and there, from previous books and throwing them in as in little walk-on roles. But I didn't want to write an actual sequel. But I did want to understand what it was like for, say, the average person to have felt that the exhilaration, the relief, the joy of VE Day, and then to have woken up the next morning and to have realized, oh, oh, things didn't magically go back to the way they were before. Um, Life is going to be difficult for a while, and I think as the realization of that unfolded quite slowly over the weeks and months that followed, but life really did not get back to normal quickly, and in fact it got worse. Rationing was quite a bit stricter. The shortages were worse, and then things were became scarce that hadn't even been scarce during the war. And then there's all the post-war, the issues of how to rebuild these bombed out cities with very few resources. I mean, if you imagine, I've described it this way actually when talking to high school students, but at in the Harry Potter books, and there's the bank Gringotts that has the vaults where Harry goes and he has a mountain of coins sitting there, and then the Weasley family had like two little coins at the bottom. That's the state of the British vaults, as it were, as a nation in post-war Britain. There was no money left. They had emptied the vaults because they'd spent everything they had fighting the war. And America did lend them some money after the war, but at quite onerous rates of return, which I always have been I find it personally that annoying that happened. But there just was no money. The coffers were empty, and so rebuilding just the infrastructure of Britain took a very long time. And what that meant for the ordinary person is that you just had to tighten your belts and grit your teeth and get on with it. And that's what I wanted to capture. But just writing a book that's, say 380 pages about post-war misery, I thought would be more than most people, including myself, would be interested in reading, right? And so I needed to tie it to something that had a moment of hope and beauty and kind of a looking towards the future. And that's when it occurred to me that the royal wedding of 1947 was such an occasion. And so it was finding the kind of the moment where ordinary people crossed paths with this wedding, where I knew I would find my story. And then almost separately, I started thinking about the gown itself, which is so often a focus point or focal point with royal weddings.
Right.
What is the bride wearing? But in this case, my question, just like with whenever I watch, whenever I've watched royal weddings in my own life, is always like, who are the people who made it? Not just the designer, but the actual the invisible
Hands-on.
hands.
Yeah.
And it was then that I realized, I will find this story in the lives of the ordinary women who came to Hartnell, the Hartnell Studios workrooms in Mayfair, and who created this gorgeous gown, and then returned home to their lives, which were absolutely would have been very difficult.
Mhm.
And so I got a little bit of both. I got ordinary life that I wanted to talk about with all the dour realities of it, but I also got to include the stardust, which I have to admit I also found fun to write about.
Was there much available to you to find out about what actually was going on in that design studio?
Very little. The reality is that no one asked questions back then, so there aren't any. And I looked and looked and looked and looked. There's just no extant interviews or really very few photographs, which makes sense in that most designers are not keen to have photographs taken freely of their workrooms, because then copyists will come in and take what avail themselves of the free ideas, as it were. And what I needed was to talk to people who had been there. But I was operating, 70 years after the fact. And it was very difficult. It was almost impossible. And so I made a decision at one point after, chasing down yet another lead that ended at a dead end. Where I just gave up for a while. I thought, I'm not going to be able to talk to anyone who was there. This is about as useful an exercise as trying to talk to somebody who fought in the Great War. I mean, I've waited too long. If I wrote this book 10 years ago, maybe, and so then I went to England with the idea of learning how the embroidery was done, so that I could not only talk to people who are doing that work today, but learn how to describe it myself, get a sense of just the physical nature of it, almost engage the muscle memory in terms of what it was like. And it was while I was there, learning how the embroidery was done. And I'm just looking, in fact, I have, this is in fact the embroidery that I did do,
Oh my God.
which is a reproduction of one of the motifs on the gown. And I'm sorry about all of that. You've got all my bookshelves in the background there. But I was then put in touch with this incredible lady called Betty Foster, who is the last surviving seamstress who worked on the gown. So she wasn't an embroiderer, even though I focused on the embroiderers, but she was in the next room, working under the same roof, knew what was going on there, as well as what was going on in her workroom. And it's as if she opened a door for me that had been closed for decades. And almost, I feel it's like as if she took me by the hand and led me through. And I would not have been able to finish writing the book without her. Or, I would have finished it, and I would have always felt there's something incomplete, because to write a book about these women, whose lives were pretty simple lives, like so many of our lives are, compared to the life of someone like the Queen. But they were beautiful lives, and these women were and are important. But to write the book and not have a chance to even talk to one of them, I would have never been happy with the book. And my gratitude to Betty, who is has now moved. She and her husband are they've been married for more than 60, well over 60 years now. They've now moved in with their daughter, but are otherwise well. And
Did you like the book?
she did. She was lovely, and I'm still in touch intermittently. When I get a new translation, I'll send her a copy of the cover at the very least. I'm not sure she necessarily wants to have, I just got news of I just got to see the final cover for the Russian translation of the gown, which is quite lovely, and so I'll send her a picture of that. I don't think she really wants the Russian translation clogging up her bookshelf, but I've sent her, a number of versions so that she can, and she loves to tell people about the book because she's a character in it. With her permission, I wrote her into the book, and so she appears in a scene in Buckingham Palace on the wedding day. And in real life, she was actually standing outside Buckingham Palace. There's a little space given to the women who worked at Hartnell, and they were given badges and kind of invitations to go and stand in this one area. And what I did is I took her from outside and I put her inside as one of the people who's helping the princess with her gown, just in case of any last minute disasters, like putting a heel through the hem. Right. She was there to help sew up any difficult any issues.
Oh, that's so great. Jennifer, I think Amber's here with another question from
wonderful.
One of our viewers.
Hi. Yes, someone says they're enjoying listening to you. We're not getting many questions because everyone is so enthralled, but there is curiosity around how the title of your latest book came about. Why did you choose Our Darkest Night?
Our Darkest Night. So when I first started writing the book, and I know this to be true from other friends, typically we'll just find a title and append it. So we're not writing novel number 7 or something like that. And so I was calling it jokingly, I should add jokingly, I was calling it The Venetian Girl. And then I was repenting of that because I was afraid that The Venetian Girl would be stuck with it forever. And I really, really did not want to write a book with the word girl in the title. I know they're popular as title, to use the word girl in a title is very popular these days. I just really, Nina is a woman, a grown woman, and but for what, that was me being whimsical at the beginning, and fortunately, my wonderful editor at HarperCollins also agreed that The Venetian Girl was a terrible title, and so then we just started brainstorming, and we came up with hundreds of titles. I typically, start with songs of the period, and work through, different options there, both looking at Italian songs and then the translation of the titles and so on. And I was looking at poet. I was reading through Dante to see if there's anything I could pull from that. And in the end, to be honest, I actually think it was my editor who came up with the title, and just as part of a cover that would also be very evocative of what there were, of this moment. So Our Darkest Night in a way really refers to 1943 and this moment of real all-encompassing darkness that fell over Italy, but always with the night is the understanding that then the morning will come eventually, and I think I've had the same cover designer for all of my books, incredible woman, incredible artist called Mumtaz Mustafa, and she just gets these books. I mean, typically, almost the first iteration is what we end up choosing. She's so talented, and she really, this cover from the beginning just captured what I felt was the story of this book. We played around a little bit with the cover, with the colors, I should add, and also there's very tiny airplanes which I was a bit fussy about because they had to be the right airplanes. And my feeling being that that I'm the one who gets the emails from people if they're the wrong airplanes. And so those are de Havilland mosquitoes, which are correct for the that the time in terms of what planes would have conceivably been flying over northern Italy. But the background is the kind of the foothills of the Alps near Monte Grappa, and I'm very happy with it. But the titles, they aren't something that most writers control, I should add. It really is a group effort, and sometimes it's hard to put one's ego as a writer aside and say, well, I want to be that, I'm the artist. It's the project of my heart. Why don't I get to decide these things? I also have to admit that I am not an expert in book marketing or book publicity and sales. That there are very, very smart people at HarperCollins who know way more about that than I do, and I have to listen to them. And so ultimately, it's a decision made by my publisher. But they haven't steered me wrong yet. I haven't had any titles that make me go, oh, so I'm very fortunate in that respect.
So did you go back then afterwards and tuck that title?
I did. There's moments
Yeah.
there, like in the book where not totally overtly, but talking about and her reflecting on kind of the all-encompassing night, but the knowledge that the dawn is a few hours away. That's what I was hoping to kind of lead people forward. And I do. This is a tough time, I will say. And I'm not saying this in a complaining way, just in a practical way. To have a book coming out about the Holocaust, which is just innately a very depressing subject. And at a time when so many people are struggling, even if you're not struggling in terms of how you're doing personally. I think a lot of people are feeling pretty glum a lot of the time, and I recognize that, and I understand why some people might be reluctant to read a book set in this time, and without giving anything away, I've been trying to just say to people, this is a book. It won't ruin your day. This is a book that's grounded in hope. It's grounded in hope and in the power of kind of a selflessness and love for others, to put right, or not to put right. You can't put anything right about the Holocaust, but to help I guess, comfort the survivors, to offer some kind of balm, to the balm in the sense of BALM, balm to the wounds. Again, there's nothing I can write that can fully capture in any way the horrors of the Holocaust and what was done to people. And by focusing on some positive elements of people's behavior, in no way do I seek to minimize, again, what was done to the Jews of Europe. Nothing can do that. But I also want to tell a story of one such person who endures, whose courage propels her along, as it did so many people, and who just is so resolute in her determination to survive. And I think sometimes there's some narratives set in the Holocaust that may possibly inadvertently diminish the bravery, the courage, the steadfast nature of those who lived through the Holocaust. That's something I think it's worth focusing on, because people who survived, the surviving was hard. Surviving meant going on without many, in some cases, all of the people that you loved, and that is an act of courage in itself. And so, to talk about whether books have happy endings or not, it's more complicated than that. I don't want to say too much more because I'm always wary of being the person who just
Gives it all away.
spoils the entire end of the book. But I do want to say that I hope that anyone reading it now who has, like, and I certainly have been struggling with feelings of gloominess a lot. I hope you will agree with me that when you finished it, that this is a book that celebrates human life and people's courage.
And
Um,
humanity. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. Jennifer, I think we have time for one more question. This
I
is
think somebody had popped up and asked what I'm working on, which I'd
that's
be
the
happy to give
one.
a little glimpse. So the working title, which in fact I think I will get to keep as a title because my editor loves it. The whole team at HarperCollins loves it. Is called Coronation Year.
Ooh.
Never more apropos that I just feel that the book has again been. I'm wishing I could write faster right now in terms of just wanting to share it with the world. So it's set in London in 1953. The backdrop is a little hotel that just happens for really the first time in say royal history. It's on Haymarket in London, which was rather unexpectedly chosen as one of the streets along which the coronation procession would pass. In the there's the Queen went from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey, and then from there was a long procession through the streets of central London before returning to Buckingham Palace. And the buildings that were on that parade route were very much in demand, and were kind of thrown into real focus in the months before the coronation. So all of that is as a backdrop for me to talk about, again, the lives of ordinary people in 1953 and Coronation Year, when at last it seemed that the shadows of World War II were behind them.
Hmm.
And I, again, am interested in, well, what was that like? What was it like to live through that year of hope and optimism? People were talking about the dawning of a new Elizabethan age, and is that something, in fact, that happened?
Hmm.
And also, just the idea of digging into life in a tiny little hotel. I love kind of finding these micro areas of interest, not really micro, but areas of interest that I can then. So if you read The Gown, you learned all about the goings on at a top London design house, and here I'm digging into what was it like to work in a quite modest little hotel that nonetheless has a long and interesting history. And of course, there's an element of suspense, which I'm not going to give away, but I hope people will be biting their fingernails by the end of the book.
And do you have any of your characters coming back for a visit?
I tentatively, there's a character called Stella in Our Darkest Night, and I won't say specifically where she's from, but if you read the book, you'll recognize her. And right at present she's there, and I never want to say definitively because people have been known to vanish in between drafts of the book, but I hope to have her there. I just love having somebody who themselves is a fish out of water in the proceedings of anything. In The Gown, it was my character Miriam, who is French, who I had to have her there just to puncture some of the kind of that deferential atmosphere towards the royals. I needed her there to kind of wrinkle her nose and say, really? And Stella herself, as an Italian, will also be handy to have as just a balancing point to all of the excitement over the coronation. Again, Stella will be there to say, really, is it actually this exciting? Because I think there's no point just going all in and not coming up for air, right? I think we, as much as I do look upon the events of the coronation with some reverence. I think also it can't be an unexamined reverence, if that makes any sense.
Jennifer, this it looks like from where I'm sitting, and I'm not doing the hard work, but it looks like you're having so much fun.
Yeah, yeah. It's been, I mean, it's been bittersweet over the last week because, I will say I got quite choked up when I learned that Prince Philip had died. I mean, he had a long and ultimately extremely interesting life. And I feel very relieved that his life came to its close in the presence of his closest family at home. I think that's probably a great relief to those who loved him. Um, uh, so there's that personal aspect, but there's also just the historian in me that finds it really fascinating to watch all of this
Mhm.
play out and to feel that we are getting towards the end of an era that has really been the backdrop to our lives, whether or not we're interested in the royal family as such. They do have an effect on Canadian history, and all sorts of practical elements of our lives. And I will be very interested to see what happens in the coming years. And I just, I think the Queen is a little bit like a granny for a lot of us. And I will say, I mean, my heart really cracked watching her by herself today. Um, it was intensely moving. Yeah.
Jennifer, thank you for this, and thank you. I know that you've got somebody, a little person at home who's not feeling very well.
Yes, that just just and how that we're all used as parents to having children bringing home germs, but we have not been anywhere. We have not left the house in ages, and yeah, so I'll be proffering up some ginger ale in the next little while, and
Yeah.
hoping they
As
feel
that, as
better.
I was saying to you before we started, the glamorous life of a
The
best-selling author,
glamorous
right?
life of a best-selling author wearing pajamas basically, and
And delivering
and
ginger ale.
yeah, yeah. But that being said, I still, I'm sure I'll carve out a quiet moment today to dig back into
Mm.
to or to time travel back to 1953. That's where I'll spend my afternoon, I'm sure.
Well, we'll look forward to taking that trip with you when the next book comes out. And I hope you notice the thank yous popping up on the screen
Oh, well,
here as
thank
well.
you to
So
everyone for listening in. And I have to say, I wish earnestly that I were in Vancouver right now, seeing everyone in person, seeing my lovely family there. But it is not to be. But maybe for coronation year, I'll make it out west.
for the next
Fingers
book,
crossed, I
yes.
do.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Cheryl.